welcome everyone to this panel discussion. Our topic today is rebuilding trust and inspiring hope in the post-COVID-19 era, Turkey's perspective on the international order. I'm Rida Fakhri. I'm a broadcast journalist for TRT World based in Washington, D.C. I host a weekly program on US politics and foreign policy and a monthly global affairs program. I'm delighted to be here to moderate this discussion. Now, since as long as I can remember covering the United Nations, and of course I can't tell you exactly when that was without dating myself, but suffice to say that for over the last 2 decades, there has been talk about Security Council reform. There has been talk about UN reform. In fact, as early as the early 1970s, people were talking about how to reform the United Nations to make it fit for purpose. Fast forward to today, though. The question is, how do we build trust? How do we rebuild trust and inspire hope in an institution that simply hasn't adapted to all the major changes and shifts the world has seen since its creation back in 1945, since the UN was founded in the aftermath of World War II. Now, 76 years ago, the main critical purpose of the victorious powers was to establish a new world order, a world order that would avert another world war, that would allow or disallow World War III to ever happen, that would govern world affairs through more fairness and equity, far away from the sheer might of the military powers and the kind of impact that had had on entire regions, whether it was Europe, Asia, or North Africa, which were all directly affected during World War II. The United Nations Agreement or Declaration, many of you will remember, was signed back in 1941, so a few years before the establishment of the United Nations. There were then 26 countries who all signed onto the promise to pursue the creation of a post-war institution, a post-war peacekeeping institution that would be dedicated to, quote, preserve the rights of man and justice. Now, at the time of the founding of the UN in 1945, there were about 51 countries who all committed to the Charter, emphasized international peace and security and good relations among nations. Try to see if this mic works better. Now, today, of course, as you all know, the UN has 193 member states. But for much of the world, the UN is seen through the very limited prism of the Security Council, and more specifically through the prism of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, those wielding the all-powerful veto. So let's perhaps have this as our starting point today, Security Council reform. Is it what is making the UN so dysfunctional? Some say it has become an anachronistic institution that keeps on perpetuating an unfair world order. Some argue that it has become obsolete. Many have said for years, this is a dying institution. The discussion has often centered on Security Council enlargement. How do you make it more representative? But is that the main issue? Is that the core issue, or maybe even a red herring, I might suggest, because many of you will know that a group of nations known as the G4 nations, that includes Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan, have for years supported each other's bids for permanent seats at the UN Security Council. They mutually support each other, and one might argue, have they been able to put forward the solution? Because you have competitive groups as well, on the other hand, groups like Uniting for Consensus, which about 21 years ago during the Millennium Summit, they were known as the Coffee Club. They essentially include countries like Pakistan, Turkey, the Republic of Korea, Spain, Mexico, Argentina, many countries from the global south that see things entirely differently. Back then, when this group began, Pakistan was leading the charge, but today Turkey seems to have taken a very forceful and vocal role in pushing for reform of the Council. In many respects, the P5s are quite happy, you might argue, to see these emerging powers fight it out amongst each other. In a way, you could say it lessens the pressure on them to implement the reforms that so many countries have been calling for. So let's maybe today start as well by identifying the problem, in addition to seeing it in the relatively new context of the additional threats that the drafters of the UN Charter back in the day could not possibly have foreseen. Threats like climate change and, of course, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So perhaps we begin our discussion today by going back to basics and addressing one of the core questions. Is the Charter at the core of the problem, or is the problem the fact, maybe some might say the claim, that the Charter is not being implemented, that it isn't being respected as it should be, first and foremost by the big powers, and also perhaps by the Secretaries General, who have the potential to be important players, or at least can be important players whenever they decide to highlight some of the issues that so many countries care about. So let's put some of these questions and many more to our panelists here today. And of course, I want to mention as well that we will be taking your questions. We want this discussion to be as inclusive and as dynamic as possible. So if you do have questions, I'll come to them a little bit later. But to kick us off, let me begin first with Colonel Rich Alton, a retired Foreign Area Officer who served in the State Department's policy planning staff and has been an advisor to several Secretaries of State. With over 30 years of active military service, he has held a variety of positions and spent a decade in the Middle East, including tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. So, Rich Alton, is the Charter the problem as you see it? Or is it that the P5s tend to use and perhaps even abuse their veto power, that they have been using the United Nations not as a public good for humanity, but rather a vehicle to further their own vested interests? Is that a fair point?
It's a fair question. I think if we put ourselves in the shoes of the people putting the Charter together, and back to those days, the aspiration not to repeat the great cataclysm of World War II, World War I before that, it's understandable that they put into place a document that was forward-looking. I don't think the problem is that it has failed to keep pace and that it was somehow initially correct. I think in a sense, it was a document that came a century too soon, because the Westphalian nature of the international system is still a fact. And by that I mean, since the Peace of Westphalia, this whole idea that nation states are sovereign and that they do not share their sovereignty and that there is no supranational sovereignty that trumps national sovereignty is still how people think in all of the countries of the world. And that goes for small countries and big countries. Now, the dilemmas that national sovereignty creates for the countries vary by the size and power of the states, and this comes to the P5. I would agree that the behavior of the P5 states in pursuing their own national interests has definitely dominated any concept of the national good, the international good. And we have to look at why that has failed to take place. In essence, what we need to do is not supersede national authority or replace national sovereignty. We need to go back to the idea from 1945 that countries will willingly pool portions of their national sovereignty in exchange for getting some things in return. And the things they need to get in return are transparency, efficiency, a mechanism that works well, which I think we all have to agree there's some problems not just with management of this massive bureaucracy in New York and the various places where there's headquarters, but the operational arms as well, the lack of coordination among them. So I think nation states, great powers and others, look at the dysfunction and they say, this is not ripe, this is not ready. I'm not ready to turn over my national interest and my national sovereignty, even in a limited scope, for something that is so dysfunctional. So I want to have some empathy for the people who put the plan together in 1945. I mean, they were trying to do something that is certainly necessary, and we can see it now in 2021, 70 years after the initial ideas were posited, as you said, that the nature of transnational threats, be it terrorism or epidemics and pandemics or global population flows and the climate, are just growing more and more intense. And yet we don't have a tool that's fit for purpose to convince those national leaders to pool that sovereignty.
But it has become a multipolar system, there's no doubt, but there is this one consensus of the United Nations that the dominant power I'm not sure if you could hear me, but I'll say that there is that consensus at the UN, and the word consensus is one that we often use, that the dominant power, the most powerful power, is obviously the United States. You mentioned the Charter of the United Nations, and to many people, yes, it does appear to be a progressive document if you keep the veto aside. But when you talk about countries willing to pool portions of their national sovereignty, is that wishful thinking? How realistic is it for the United States to accept, to rewrite the rules that President Franklin D. Roosevelt put in place back then with the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, essentially to forego the veto and invite more people into the tent? Is that wishful thinking?
Well, it's a bit beyond what I contemplate to entirely forego the veto. And I think certainly as the primary funder of many UN operations, the operational budget, of course, it depends heavily on U.S. contribution. I don't think that would be wise for us to do. But I think we can contemplate reforms because, by the way, it's frustrating for the United States as well to have China or Russia veto things that we think are eminently in the international interest. Let's look at Syria as a great example of this conflict that's gone on for 10 years with 500,000 people killed, with I think 5 or 6 million refugees, 11 million people displaced by the conflict. It is a shame that the system, and the P5 in particular, have not been able to bring a settlement that would bring these people home and have some sort of a reasonable conclusion.
You seem to be putting the onus on China and Russia,
Well,
but of course the same can be said about the United States when it comes to the Palestine-Israel conflict. We'll get to that later.
We're checkmating one another on these important things. And one of the reforms that I personally think is worth pursuing is what's been called the weak veto. And we've talked about in our preparation for this different sorts of reforms that are posited for the Security Council. I'm not a fan of increasing the number. There are people who want to go to, maybe the P9, P10, or who want to increase the number of non-permanent member states so that we have 25 total. I think this would just exacerbate the current problems. But I do favor what's called a weak veto. And a weak veto would say that no single state among the permanent members has a veto right. But if you get 2, or I think there was an earlier version of this that said 3, with the Kofi Annan's plan, yes. Right? I think that would require a little bit of horse trading and a little bit of negotiation among the P5 that now simply doesn't exist because of the single right to a veto.
But you still not forego the veto. And of course, some people might ask the question, is there any justification today that countries like the UK and France should not only remain permanent members, but also hold on to this veto? We'll get to these points in a second, but I want to introduce Kilic Kanat. He is Research Director at the SETA Foundation, which is a foundation for political, economic, and social research in Washington, D.C. He's also Assistant Professor of Political Science at Penn State University. Kilic Kanat, Turkey, as we said moments ago, is leading the charge for real reform at the United Nations, saying that the conversation needs to begin, that its ideas don't have to be the be-all and end-all, but it's a place to begin. President Erdogan, and I'd like to quote from a little paragraph in his new book, which is entitled "A Fairer World is Possible." He says, quote, "We want the Security Council to be restructured in a fair way, which could represent different continents, faiths, ethnic groups, and cultures as much as possible. If it happened, that would be a revolutionary step to solve international issues and reconstitute global peace." The question, though, is, will reform of the Council, better representation, redress the current dysfunction? Would it be enough? Because the UN isn't just the UN Security Council. It's also the different organs of the United Nations. It's also the Secretariat, which are also structured along a very specific way, where the big powers tend to head the main departments. It's an entire system. Where do you begin with these reforms?
Because of that, he said it should be a revolutionary. Reform may be not sufficient to provide UN Security Council reform. Just to add something that Rich mentioned previously, to blame the UN Charter would be being not fair to the founding fathers of the United Nations. I think when they were trying to establish this organization, there were different pressure points to try to convince the victorious powers to join this organization, to convince nation states to share their sovereignty, to try to establish the organization so that it would prevent another warfare. There was too much pressure. And part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and make everybody to sign into this. It was a major, I think, mission done here.
They did sufficiently,
the-
but was the foundation that they laid
yeah, that was the foundation
with the right
of the organization.
foundation?
But the implementation of the policies and how the charter would be implemented, how the global political system, especially the Cold War that came after that, influenced the functioning of the organization is a totally different story. When they were probably establishing this organization, they were thinking about a potential World War III, but they weren't thinking the regional conflicts that may happen, like Palestinian-Arab issue, right? Or the Syrian crisis, or another humanitarian crisis that would lead to the biggest refugee crisis in the world since World War II. So what they were thinking when they were making their threat assessment was particularly to prevent a World War III, which they did. They were successful, I guess. But when it comes to more specific issues, I think the organization itself needs to have a moving target. And it should have a mission that is flexible, that can adapt to certain circumstances. If the United Nations cannot resolve a problem in Middle East that started 70 years ago, right? And resolution after resolution, or crisis after crisis, warfares, and low intensity crisis since then, I think there is a problem about those who are running the organization.
But however flexible the mission is, isn't the fundamental problem that it will always remain hostage to a few countries? The Security Council, permanent 5 members. Do you see the day when any of them would relinquish their veto power? Because there's always going to be horse trading and vested interest involved.
Because of that, I was saying that it was, I think, a temporary measure to convince these states, both putting Soviet Union and United States for the, in an organization to convince them to be in the same organization. I think it was necessary at that point. And it may have some kind of legitimacy in the Cold War years that Soviet Union wouldn't be part of that or United States wouldn't be part of that if there wasn't a veto power. But especially after the Cold War, I think with the change in international system, there had to be a rapid rethinking about these international institutions. And I'm not talking about only United Nations or UN Security Council, all of the organization. So it's a new world. United States was talking about a new world order, right? If it's a new world order, we need a new UN. And what will be the new UN? And there was a lot of red flags coming out. North Korea was testing its nuclear weapon, right? Bosnia, there was ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. Rwanda, there was a genocide. All of these things were coming. And it includes pandemic, right? SARS crisis, Ebola crisis, everything was coming. But there was this dysfunctionality, and everybody considered the status quo, and many emerging powers lost their hope for a potential revision of the UN Security Council. I think what was mistaken, especially after the end of the Cold War, was nobody was thinking that we may need UN again.
And that is the question. How essential, Richardson, does the UN remain with all of its flaws? Because as we say, lots of people, it's easy to say we need reform. Secretaries General have said it. The last Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, said reform of the Council is long overdue. The necessary expansion must be made considering how much the world has changed. Yes, it's all very easy to put out these rhetorical questions. Can the UN sustain itself? And can it live up to its aspirations if it remains the way it is?
There are many people who make the argument that the United Nations has become an afterthought, or because its functions are presumed, that people are less and less willing, certainly in the United States this is true, willing to fund it because they don't see the impacts every day. There are impacts, for instance, which I referred to earlier in the case of Syria. While the UN could not prevent or resolve the conflict, it's done great work in ameliorating the condition of the Syrian refugees, helping to a great extent with those in Turkey, for instance. So I think it remains relevant in some very limited sort of functional areas that are considered non-controversial to those great powers. But look, a reform or even a new world order doesn't mean we're in a utopia. We're still going to live in a world in which the powerful states do what they can and the less powerful states do what they must. So the question again is not how do we replace the prerogatives of great power states, and this means China, Russia, frankly India, Germany, many of these other countries, Brazil, have reasons to press for a greater role, and they should. And we should find some ways to convince those to more fulsomely support the operations of the United Nations, to have a greater voice in the operations and the decisions of the United Nations. But in the end, it's never going to be a situation where all voices are equal, nor should it be. Because at the end of the day, the United Nations can only be as effective as is the desire of those great powers to live by and enforce the decisions it takes. So it's a complicated question. I think it will survive. I think it must survive because the increasing globalization and connectedness of the world means that these problems are rapidly shared problems. And COVID's a great example because this virus that came out of Wuhan very quickly became, as a result of flights daily between Wuhan and Italy and France and the United States, it became an international problem. And I think we really need to understand why the World Health Organization, the health arm of the United Nations, failed for 2 or 3 months when this pandemic could have been nipped in the bud more effectively. And we need to strengthen the functionality that represents. So I think it's possible. I don't think it's going to be done over the wishes of the great powers there. You have to convince them, again, that this dog will hunt, as we say in the United States. When you say that dog won't hunt, that means don't put any money into it because it's never going to do its job. I think this dog has hunted before, to press the metaphor, and I think the dog will hunt, but we have to be very careful about where we apply its functionalities.
How do you convince them? How do you force them into accepting change?
Can I add
that's
something
always a
that
tough one.
Rich mentioned? I think this functionality is something that can trickle down. So when the UN Security Council become dysfunctional, you can see that all of the affiliated agencies would have this functionality. Of course, when we are talking about this, we are not talking about the dedicated stuff of UNHCR or UNICEF that we see on the ground in crisis areas. They do a very dedicated work, a very brave work. But what happens is they can, even when you talk with the staff members on the ground, you will see that they are frustrated with this functionality, right? They see that their resources are overstretched. They're not efficient. They cannot be more efficient because of some bureaucratic difficulties, which has something to do with the great power rivalry on the, that is the trickle-down effect of a problem in UN Security Council goes all the way to a refugee camp in Jordan.
And what they see and what is particularly demoralizing to staff members, and I've been, speaking to quite a few over the years, is that there is this complete reluctance and unwillingness to take on the big powers.
Yeah.
Not even on the part of the Secretary General, the UN, you might argue, its image, its presence has really changed over the last few years since the Iraq War. Kofi Annan famously, at one point, having to admit to a journalist that yes, he believed when he was pressed in 2004, so after the war, he said yes, he believed it was illegal that the powers, the United States and others, went to war without that second Security Council authorization. So again, the question of how do you make sure that this organization is willing to speak up when it's important to do so in order to restore trust and confidence.
When it gets to that point, I'd say it's too late. If it gets to the point where the organization, as the primary multilateral forum of the world globally, has to take on a great power, it's already lost.
But when the U.S. is the one who sort of is
the case with
big
us.
elephant in the
You cannot
room.
force the United States or China or Russia, frankly, to do anything. So what it must do is it must co-opt, it must convince. So this is where I get to this pooled sovereignty idea, and the idea that through a more proactive, forward-looking, and a reform of the policy wing of the United Nations is critical here. Something more forward-looking so we can work to get buy-in from these major powers and understand the art of possible before it comes to trying to ask one of the great powers to do something they simply won't do.
Would it take a Captain America or someone else to sort of put it all together?
I
Better
think
good.
it is the ironic. This trust comes with search for a solution at the same time. Yes, they are. But what you see, especially with the Generation Z, every country is discussing what Generation Z is after and trying to figure out what are their political inclinations, social preferences, right, and their hopes about future. What you see is, yes, they are much more interconnected. They are much more global citizens. They care about global problems more than my generation or rich generation, right? And they are sensitive for national sovereignty and those kind of concepts, but they are more ready to cooperate transnationally. I think that is the most significant thing. And at a certain point, everybody at the United Nations, since they are the governments, they are representing people, they will, I think, hear this voice. Because what we see, especially in recent years, with increasing interest and sensitivity about climate change, is it is not a top-down thing. Yes, we know that United Nations warned about that, United Nations Environmental Program warned about that for years now. But it has not been that effective. But recent floods, recent forest fires, and what we are seeing that it is bottom-up approach, right? And the pressure and the increasing interest of young people to climate, things like pandemic, after this point probably, technology, right? Sharing technology. And all of those things are basically becoming much more important for United Nations, not because the government around the world want it, but public is much more sensitive about it.
Yeah, and there's a certain paralysis, Richardson, isn't there, when the key countries aren't interested in moving. You can have 193 member states at the General Assembly, all very, excited to move in one direction, but as long as the P5 don't, nothing really moves. So again, the idea of just how sustainable is it? I mean, here's a radical idea. Is it completely absurd, or is it something that could happen one day? Just scrapping the Security Council altogether.
Well, that could work if the United Nations wants to refocus away from the security concerns that led to the creation of the Council. So what are the core competencies of the United Nations? It's very clear that countries like Turkey and the United States are going to do what they feel they need to do in their national interest and act unilaterally on security matters. That's just the case. There is no amount of United Nations resolutions, for instance, that will change Turkey's position on the PKK or that would get it to sort of alter its counterterror operations. Similarly with the United States and Al-Qaeda or ISIS, we are not going to leave that or delegate that to anybody else. If the United Nations, and by the way, at the time that the P5 was formed and that structure was formed, there was kind of a very limited set of countries that had the ability to conduct security operations and project power. Yeah. That's much more multipolar now than it was
regional
then.
Groups that could do
So
that.
maybe de-emphasizing that role and focusing on core competencies like the climate, which affects us all, and frankly should be far less, pooling sovereignty to some degree in those fields, or to a greater degree than we are now, should be far less contentious, even in countries like Turkey and the United States that are very sovereignty focused, than it would be on the security issues. So don't try to solve the issues that we're poorly suited for as an organization and as a mechanism. Focus on those things that are easier. And none of the national governments know how to fix, for instance, the irregular migrant flow. None of us know how to help care for refugees in the various broken states and sort of troubled states that we have. And none of us know how to deal effectively with cyber issues and with the pandemic. So those areas there, I think, is where we should focus. I don't think it's utopian or sort of fantasy, the realm of fantasy to do this. It's the realm of fantasy to try to do it on top-level national security concerns for each of the big powers, because that's just not how big powers act. So know what we're good at and focus on developing better tools and better pooled sovereignty in those areas. And I think that it can restore, and by the way, organizational change too, because we are living in a bureaucracy. When you're talking about the United Nations, it's a bureaucracy that's decades and decades and decades old. And that's sort of in abeyance of the rewiring of children's minds that we talked about because of the connected age that we live in. The organizations that implement UN decisions and operations and programs have to think and move more like the younger generation that's coming up. So organizational change combined with refocus on key competencies.
Can I add one thing? I think the reform can be the next step. I think an issue-based cooperation among states that can spill over and become much more, something very technical, that can spill over, become much more social, economic, and finally political, can actually make UN Security Council less important within the United Nations itself. Think about now organizations like UN Environmental Program, right? If they start a program and if there is an effective cooperation among states to stop climate change, and if it brings a result, I think it would build the trust for the UN as well. It may not make UN Security Council much more relevant or much credible, but it would still make that this organization still matters, this organization is important, and it touches to the daily life of the people, just like UNHCR, just like UNICEF.
And worth remembering a few of the key fundamental parameters that the UN set itself many years ago, the Security Council was established, quote, in order to ensure prompt and effective action by the United Nations. Its members confer on the Security Council primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, and agree that in carrying out its duties under this responsibility, the Security Council acts on their behalf. This is paragraph 1 of Article 4 of the UN Charter. A number of operative words we tend to forget: prompt and effective action, primary responsibility, which doesn't mean exclusive responsibility, and then the idea of the UN Security Council acting on behalf of the UN member states, not the other way around. How do we reset these parameters without rocking the boat and changing anything too fundamentally, or do we need to?
I think what Rich mentioned a minute ago about changing security perception, right? We are talking about not this, like securing people and providing a way to stop the World War III, since this is not an urgent threat anymore, right? What people are feeling that things like climate change, things like pandemic, things like economic inequalities around the world, poverty, is much more significant. And they are the real threats that needs more urgent responses and prompt responses. So I think what makes the Charter, I think Charter is still relevant, but in terms of UN Security Council, as I mentioned, it doesn't need to be the only organization that should basically determine some policies. I think that then what President Erdogan mentioned, the democratization of the organization is not only a horizontal kind of trying to make the organization equal, everybody equal. I think if the primary function of some of the main units of the United Nations, for example, for Turkey being a more effective UNHCR, for Africa maybe having a more effective UNICEF, right? And for all countries around the world to have a better environmental program. I think that level of democratization, institutional democratization, is much more important.
I'm less worried about democratization and more worried, and not that it's not important, but I'm more worried about effective function. And there's another old American saying that nothing succeeds like success. And by that I mean that you need to find a couple of success stories. We don't have a lot of big success stories for the United Nations, certainly not in conflict management. When we look at Nagorno-Karabakh, which we looked at, the Israel-Palestinian problems, which from the American perspective look a little differently, obviously, than from either a Turkish or a Lebanese or for a Russian or whatever perspective, but finding the right balance, having credibility with both sides in these conflicts. Where has it succeeded? Go back far enough, you can find UN role in the Balkans back in the 1990s, which was also not a great success story, because in the end it was only the commitment of the large nation states of the United States and Europe essentially that helped resolve that. We need to figure out what it is that the UN can really do well in this decade, and it needs to do it. And then it will develop a different reputation than what it's got now. It might be peacekeeping, but there's huge problems with the peacekeeping operations that we've all followed. It might be sort of the famine and relief. I think World Food Program and a number of the UN-related agencies that do refugee care have done very, very well. But in essence, what we have is a branding issue, right? The UN is associated with mediocrity and with bureaucratic ineffectiveness. Right. So we need to figure out what it is it's good at. People will, and especially the younger generation, will think much more in terms of like ownership of the UN, like we own it and let's support it when it is winning, as opposed to doing things poorly and being a source of problems.
Rebranding it or repurposing it to make sure that it actually tackles the problems that it is best at tackling.
First the repurposing and the rebranding will follow.
All right, Kilic, a couple of things that I want to sort of touch on before I take some questions from the audience, and I hope we have a few. COVID-19 and the pandemic and the depth of the inequalities that it has exposed, not just among nations, but within nations as well. How has it impacted the UN? And when I say UN, I mean the UN system, meaning WHO and the entirety of the UN system.
I think the COVID-19 changed a lot of things, and one of the most important things it changed. You know, like when the COVID-19 crisis emerged, there was a lot of debate whether it will change things, whether things will remain same. I think those who thought that it would basically expedite the existing trends in international system was right. And one of the existing trends in international system was distrust to international institutions, right? And it expedited because on the one hand, everybody knew that every major health agencies, every intelligence agency knew that there will be a crisis, right? There will be a global health crisis. In United States even, when you read 2017 and 2018 Worldwide Threat Assessment Report, they basically said there will be COVID crisis, right? And this COVID crisis would be huge. It may stop economies around the world, shut down economies, cause the killing of, death of probably millions of people. So everybody knew a little about that. And international institutions probably knew a little bit about it. But when the crisis erupted, we see that none of the international institutions was ready for it. And it is not only here criticizing UN. EU was unprepared, right? World Health Organization was unprepared. And we kind of get the impression that NATO was also unprepared, right, for a threat like this. So I think the COVID-19 crisis contributed for this urge for rethinking about international institutions. Because we understand that nation states cannot handle this problem. We always talked about there will be global problems. But we never really think about global problems. For example, about terrorism, right? We never think about terrorism as a global problem. Every country know that it's a global problem, but every country tried to take its own measures to prevent it. And they were successful, right, to prevent a terrorist attack. But pandemic was something totally different. It is a real global problem that even if you do everything right, it may still come and haunt you. And in this measure, the international institutions are probably the only way to provide this coordination of the policy, cooperation among states, and preventing these major gaps emerging not only in vaccination, testing, right, access to PPE and everything. And we figure out that in this pandemic, there was inequality when it comes to testing, inequality in access to PPE, and right now, inequality in reaching vaccines, right, and vaccination process.
Especially
so
in
when
Africa.
we look at right now, around 30-35% of the world is vaccinated, and when you look at the distribution, you will see that most of them are advanced economies.
And when you look at Africa, it's
Yes.
1 or 2% at best
And in
of the
Africa,
populations are vaccinated.
they were telling that Africa is doing really good because there is not much case, and we figure out that it was actually, there isn't much testing going on.
Yeah.
So all of those things reveal the global inequality about these things, reveal that international institutions needs to do more. And because of that, actually, this inequality, Turkey from the very beginning started to, it was way before Pfizer or Moderna come up with the vaccine or present that to FDA, that Turkey and several other countries stated that if there will be a vaccine for this, it should be universally, like a formula or whatever, universally shared. And it should be an equal distribution of this. But what we see is, even the COVAX program of the World Health Organization, we see that it's not sufficient.
It certainly exposed the limits of collective action. There's absolutely no doubt. You say it came almost out of nowhere and left a lot of organizations, countries, totally unprepared. One would hope that in the next 100 years, if a pandemic of that magnitude happens every century or so, that we are going to be much better prepared, you would think. But talking about something...
Can I add one more point?
Go ahead.
Since you mentioned responsibility, I think what this pandemic can add is this public, for the first time, the countries around the world, the people around the world started to hold an international institution as the responsible, right? World Health Organization is being criticized at the public level for not doing this, like the right, or for not being effective at the beginning of the crisis. So I think this can open the way that international, like publics in different countries started to have this conversation, not only about national governments, not only about great powers, but international institutions as well. I think it can pave the way for a more effective public debate about international
But
institutions.
aren't these
Because
international
this-
organizations a reflection of their membership?
Yeah, because this has been a very elite debate to talk about reform at the UN. This is a debate that is going on only among some technocrats, political elites, right, and foreign policy elites. But for the first time, this pandemic can bring this debate at the public level.
And it's a bad sign that you got a communication from the World Health Organization decrying the fact that you criticize them. Because actually, if you want to start expanding the sort of ownership feelings that the people have in each of the respective nations, including the great powers, towards international institutions, then you have to open those institutions up to accountability. And if they're not willing to be criticized and say, you know what, we made serious errors in how we responded to this, if that's not transparent, then there will be no reform, not significant reform. And if there is no reform, there'll be no increase in functionality. If there's no increase in functionality, then the great powers are right to say, go play in a corner, we'll just do our thing on a national basis.
But isn't the problem with these international organizations, whether it's the UN system, the World Bank, that it is a sum, a reflection of its member states, and the financial contributions, let's face it, that each member state makes to these organizations, whether it's China in the case of WHO or the United States in the case of the United Nations?
Well, that's a great point, and I think that the authoritarian inclination that some states, specifically the People's Republic of China, are trying to weave into the fabric of international institutions is very deleterious to the building of good faith and trust, especially in countries that are more democratic. And I think World Health Organization, frankly, it should examine its conscience in regards to that. But it is hardly the only institution in which authoritarian countries are trying to make accountability more rather than less accessible.
Let me tap into your military security expertise and talk about a crisis that, unlike the COVID-19 pandemic, was not hard to foresee. The crisis in Afghanistan, a country that has been at war for at least the last 5 decades. A country whose stability is so crucial to an entire region and important regional powers. We have Qatar, we have Turkey now playing a quite forceful role in bringing some stability to the country. Turkey might be in a little bit of a tricky position, being a NATO member as well. But the idea, Rich Outzen, of recognition of a government, whether you like it or not, whether you agree with its beliefs or not, this is the situation today. It's a fait accompli. The Taliban have taken charge. They formed a government. What will the United States do about it? Because the Russians and the Chinese have made headways in suggesting that they will recognize this new government. What will the Americans do?
So I think a rush to recognize or legitimize a government that has seized power by force and that is already implementing policies, if we are to believe many reports coming from many parts of Afghanistan, that violate important parts of our concept of human rights and the United Nations Charter, would be a very unpopular move at home. Legitimization and engagement with a government that has come about not through the sort of democratic process or through an organic growth among the different constituent parts of that country, when power is seized from the top down rather than from the bottom up, as happened in the case of Afghanistan, legitimacy should not be automatically conveyed. It should be, the legitimacy and engagement should be a function of performance.
But the US bestowed quite considerable legitimacy, let's face it, on the Taliban, didn't it, when it signed the peace agreement with the Taliban directly, sort of sidestepping the Afghan government back in February of 2020. I mean, the signs were written on the wall that they were eventually going to take over.
It recognized the Taliban as an important warring party. And we never withdrew legitimacy or recognition of the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, GIROA. I don't think that was the problem. Now, as a practical matter, did that convince people within Afghanistan, and especially people who were fighting on behalf of GIROA, that the United States had thrown in its lot with the other side, or was at best agnostic? I think you can make that argument. But
well, the agreement was signed between the US government and the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, interestingly, also known as the Taliban, which the US was quick to point out in the agreement it did not recognize as a state.
Exactly.
But the name, the Islamic Emirate, was already sort of written there.
They can call themselves whatever they want, but the proof will be in the pudding. We'll wait and see how their actual performance is. But for my part, I'm not confident that that movement will be able to govern Afghanistan in an accountable, responsible, and unified manner. We'll see where that all sits in 3 to 6 months, but at the moment what we've got is a violent group that seized power and holds Kabul and is killing people, conducting executions in different parts of the country, and has caused a mass exodus of people who have been raised to expect democracy and rights. So certainly, to go back to the original question, I don't think that you'll see the United States do what China and Russia are implying that they're going to do. We'll see if there is any moderation or accountable behavior on the part of the Taliban. I don't expect it, and then we'll be in a different sort of a situation.
So the US may still be in a bind for a while, figuring out what to do, because at the same time there are these warnings from the UN chief for refugees and UNHCR and so on, saying that there could be a huge humanitarian catastrophe, and we're already seeing the signs of that. Plus the refugee influx out of Afghanistan, and what that might mean for regional.
I will add something.
But let me just finish the question. Okay. And what that might mean to regional powers like Turkey and others. How tricky is the situation?
Right, you're the good cop, I'm the bad cop. Is that
for those countries? All right.
So I will soften the tone this time with a novel. Right? There is a Gabriel Garcia Marquez wrote this novel, The Chronicle of a Dead Foretold. It's the story of the murder of a guy called Santiago Nasser. And since Marquez has been a journalist for long years, he basically chronicled how the murder happened. And from the very beginning, everybody in the town know that he will be murdered. He will be murdered by two brothers, right? Everybody knew that, but nobody took action to stop this, right? So when the United States announced that it will withdraw its forces, when Biden administration announced that it will withdraw its forces by September 11, what happened? Everybody said that there will be major crisis. And interestingly, they all said that the main crisis would be the evacuation of people, right? Everybody said it would be a second cycle. Everybody, right? Only some ardent supporters of Biden said it may not be. But it was coming, right? And in Turkey, there is this, funny thing called bir cisim yaklaşıyor. It is like something is coming. Everybody is like something is coming, right? So there was no at least we don't see that after seeing Kabul airport, no effective security measures, no protection of the airport, no handling of the people, at least listing them and preparing them to leave Afghanistan for wherever. And we see the most, they were thinking that it would look like Saigon. It becomes worse than Saigon. So I think this has something to do with not only sometimes in the United States and in many other countries, they think that policy is when you come up with a policy, you don't need a strategy. It's wishful thinking. And wishful thinking is basically we will withdraw and Afghan forces will stay and they will be in control and we are not expecting any humanitarian crisis. And everything went out there, right? So they were expecting first 6 months, 3 months, but Afghan forces suddenly, basically, Kabul was captured, a humanitarian crisis emerged. So it was like everybody knew about this crisis 6 months ago, and it was surprising to see that it happens that way.
Should it have been foreseen, short-sightedness or lack of preparedness in strategizing?
It should have been seen. And I agree with the thrust of Kılıç's criticism here. I will say, to be fair, that it is not the prevailing notion in the United States that once you have a policy, you don't need a strategy. That is a pathology, and it's a mistake, and it's a problem that crops up a lot. Nobody consciously thinks that. It's just because of poor execution, we'll say, and certainly the Biden administration is guilty of that in this case. They failed to account for that strategically.
But it happened in Iraq, you'd agree. A lot of officials have said that there was lack of putting together a strategy in place for the reconstruction.
So
Syria.
There were no, just so you know, not for Afghanistan and not for Iraq was there any shortage of strategies. There were tons of strategies. There was great intelligence. The problem, the dysfunction comes at the policy level, because in a democracy, you can have all the logistics, you can have all the weapons, all the resources, and a great strategy, but it's a matter of what your political leaders determine will happen. And when they come up with an arbitrary plan that says do X by date Y, I don't care what the conditions are, all the strategies go out the window. So my point about this, though, is not whether it was a disaster or not. It was horribly done, although I commend the American and Turkish and other NATO forces that conducted under very difficult conditions and with some loss of life, as you know, from some of our heroic servicemen and women, they did a great humanitarian thing and got a lot of people out. So let us not conflate the disastrous policy decision about how this was implemented with the heroism on the ground. But I can't help but think that for the international community, this is not just going to damage faith in the United States' ability to conduct a withdrawal or successfully conclude a war. This is also about the international system, right? This is about, because it wasn't just the United States that was in Afghanistan. NATO was in Afghanistan. This was a 20-year project for NATO. The Turks were in with us at the start, and they stayed as long as we were there, but not just the Turks as well, the Brits and others. And by the way, the United Nations had extensive programs and still does to an extent in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was an experiment to see if the world, as an international community, could take a country that was broken before we got there as a result of decades of war starting back in the 1970s, whether the international community could work together to improve what might be the most difficult national condition in the world. And I have to say, at this point, it appears to have failed. And that's going to have echoes and ramifications for people's faith in international institutions and in the leadership of the great powers.
And again, it might go back to the idea of collective action and coming to some kind of agreement when you've got so many forces on the ground, as you mentioned, NATO forces in Afghanistan, not just the American contingency. And you hear NATO officials say that their opinion, their advice wasn't taken into account.
On the withdrawal, that's true.
That makes you wonder, how could you have averted this? And
but for 20 years, we actually did work together. And after 20 years, what was left was so fragile. You know, so this is not just a story of 6 months of failure.
On the pullout, there was no coordination.
On the pullout, the coordination was bad. On the 20 years of trying to build the Giroa into something survivable, I think there was a lot of goodwill shown. I mean, look, the Russians were not blowing things up in Kabul to try to kill Americans. The Chinese were not invading. There were certain issues that we had with other countries in the region, but by and large, Europe and even countries that are not inclined to want to see the United States succeed in international ventures like this tried to make Afghanistan at least semi-stable, right? Nobody had an interest in instability of this, and it still didn't work. And that's a daunting lesson.
Lessons, and that's the next question. Before I really do take a question, if I can see any hands raised, I will go to the question from the floor. But in the meantime, we end up on you saying lessons learned. I wonder for the big former empires of the world, the lessons, the graveyard of empires that Afghanistan was, not just for the British, for the Soviets as well, and then now for the Americans. By any stretch of the imagination, you couldn't possibly say that this is a war that ended well for the United States. What kind of lessons will be learned? Because now we hear President Biden say, you know, we're out of Afghanistan, but we are going to stay committed to taking out, quote unquote, suspected terrorists through these over-the-horizon policies or strategies. What does that mean? Doesn't that mean the perpetuation of wars? They may not look like occupations anymore, but there will be the continuation of conflict.
I think the lesson should be, you know, you don't need a lot of strategies. The United States might have a lot of strategies about Afghanistan, but you need an exit strategy. So in the absence of exit strategies, all other strategies will fail.
Exit strategy, or do you need to think twice before going into these countries?
Yeah, of course, you know, like the Soviet Union didn't have exit strategy. United States, I don't know what the exit strategy of the United States from Afghanistan was, right? So you need to have an exit strategy, and the failure of the exit strategies can basically defeat all of the good strategies that was successfully operationalized or implemented.
So in the last few minutes that we have, perhaps we can wrap up our conversation, Kilic, to you first, on a positive, constructive note. The long-term solution, as you see it, to make sure that the multilateral system is relevant and lives up to people's expectations?
I think, as I mentioned about the reforming of the organization, I think it's a bottom-up approach. I think people thinking more about these international institutions and expecting their governments to act differently in the international institutions, to have higher hopes about these international institutions, and to understand that we may have some problems, challenges in the future that national governments cannot resolve. That countries around the world, people around the world should unite together against. I think that bottom-up approach would be the best approach to reform or rethink about these institutions.
Kilic Kanat, thanks very much. Rich Alton, your thoughts, because in recent years we've been hearing about this trend of deglobalization, reflective of this loss of hope. How do you reestablish the hope and the trust?
Well, I think we should recognize that globalization as it was pursued in the 1990s and in the aughts produced a counter-reaction in many different societies. And in some ways, maybe we weren't ready to go to a world in which population and money and businesses and conflict and pandemics were moving so quickly. So we didn't adjust. Our systems opened up. What happened after 1990, 91 is fantastic, but it's also sort of bewildering in that the borders came down, east and west, money started flowing, computers came online that connected us all at the same time. So the division of the world into east and west ended at the same time that money flows and technology flows were rapidly increasing, and in a sense there was an overdose, right? I think we overdosed on globalization, and there was a natural reaction to that. I think now that we've seen what deglobalization looks like, and we see the problems on the horizon with that, we need to have a serious conversation among not just those countries who, like Turkey, who say, hey, we are an emerging power, we're stronger than we were a generation ago, we have a right to have a say in this dialogue. Those countries, but yes, also the top dogs, so to speak, right now, the Chinas, the Russias, the United States, need to recommit amongst themselves to recognizing the legitimacy and the universality of the United Nations. And by the way, I'm a conservative American, which means that I've got some issues with that. That's not an easy thing to do. That's why I'm very careful with what types of sovereignty I'm willing for us to compromise and pool on. But it's got to be done. There needs to be not a new charter, but a new recommitment by those major powers to it. In exchange for that, every organ within the United Nations needs to make the same promise of transparency and efficiency, accountability, like what we were talking about with the World Health Organization, so that the people who are paying for these things, the taxpayers in different countries, don't think that it's a bad investment. I think if those two things are done, then this will be an organization that can adapt to the challenges of the coming century.
Rich Alton and Kilic Kanat, thank you both very much. A very interesting conversation, obviously, that doesn't end here, but as you say, the need for a serious conversation and serious rethink about how big powers use their powers and authority within the United Nations and elsewhere, and how they share those powers more equitably to create a more representative, democratic world. Perhaps a tall order, but certainly something worth looking to and hoping for. Thank you all so much for being with us. So glad you were able to follow this conversation with us. I'm Rida Fakhri. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thanks.